Hello and welcome to this episode of the AI AEC Show. My name is Arni Heiskanen and my guest is Marty Rozmanith, co-founder and CTO at Schema, where he and his team develop the world's first BIM Knowledge Reuse Engine. Marty, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Arnie. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Well, you have had a remarkable journey in the AEC tech space with AutoCAD and leading the requirements team for Revit. Tell us a bit about that and how these experiences shaped your perspective on BIM and its evolution.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's interesting, when we were working on these things in the 90s, the term BIM didn't exist yet, and so it's always insightful to kind of go back to first principles and think about what motivated, and that's probably the source of your question. So, as far as I'm concerned, I started out in construction actually, as a carpenter on a framing crew. The last building I did commercially was a medical office building in New Jersey, and that was back in the 80s. I was studying at the time architectural engineering, but I was doing field work, which you learn a lot of lessons from doing field work about what really happens out there versus what everybody thinks happens out there. I practiced architecture. I don't have an architecture degree. I have an architectural engineering degree, and I did a lot of work in construction management. I took a lot of extra classes in both structural engineering and once I graduated, I actually worked as a practicing architect seeking licensure in 4 different firms, the last 2 of which were in California, which is how I got to know the Autodesk guys. I also did structural engineering during that time. So it was from the time I spent in the profession, it was I think a good um, time to see all of the different interactions between the parts of the design and construction value chain. And one of the things I was convinced of when I was doing my thesis at Penn State was that integration of the data between design and construction was going to be essential to helping improve things in the field, because there was a lot of waste that I directly saw when I was working on a crew. And so I wrote a thesis on integrating design and construction data way back, in '89. And we're still wrestling with a lot of those problems. During the course of this career, especially in San Francisco, I had a good friend who was of the same mindset that data integration was going to be key. His name was Patrick Mays. He unfortunately passed away in a car accident a couple of years ago. But he was a licensed architect. He was also his general contractor before he was an architect. So he was an interesting guy, and he had this very same opinion. And in fact, he wrote a book called Construction Management, which was published by Wiley, and you can still get it on Amazon. And it's a great guide for architects to understand what goes on out there. But that's sort of the background. I eventually made the decision that I should be working on the tools rather than building buildings, because I can impact what the professions are doing way more by impacting the tools they use, and I think that's proved to be the case.
Yeah, but you said that BIM didn't exist as a concept back in the early 90s. What is your definition of BIM?
Everybody has a different definition of BIM, which is why I chuckle at it. When we designed Revit, we called it the world's first parametric building modeler, because the team came from Parametric Technology Corp. Most of them, they had just worked on the world's first parametric solid modeler for mechanical, and so they took a lot of that knowledge to create Revit. Um, that was a category that, like all category kings, you want to create a category where you're the only one that can satisfy the constraints of the category. So it was a very narrow category, a parametric building modeler that nobody else could fit into. And it was really Autodesk that invented the term BIM, because they needed a much broader marketing umbrella to tell a story around for multiple products. In fact, our co-founder Richard had a hand in creating that term. So it's an interesting fact of history that we're now dealing with the repercussions of that term. My definition of it is the creation of a 3D model for executing the project. Most of what we do with BIM today is limited to LOD 300, 350 for the purpose of producing permit drawings. Revit was designed as a coordination vehicle for permit drawings. And so largely speaking, that's still where its strength lies today, in the coordination of permit drawings. But there are, and then once you get past that, people labeled that a different thing, VDC, for doing LOD 400 modeling for the purpose of construction and subcontractor modeling. But in my mind, BIM and VDC aren't different things. They should be the same thing. And the fact that they're different things is a failing, because then that data isn't integrated. And what we get instead is a bunch of clash detection tools.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, let's discuss Schema AI. What specific challenges in our industry inspired the creation of Schema AI? What is the story behind?
So the story of Schema is one that I was working on M&A due diligence when I was at Dassault Systems. So besides working for Autodesk, I also worked for their major competitor for the last 10 years before I left in 2022 to start Schema. One of the things that we had discovered was this team building a platform called Creo, Kreo, for industrial construction LOD 400 modeling for panelization and modularization of buildings. And they were going after the construction supply chain. And I had put them on the Dassault M&A radar. Dassault elected not to do anything there. I had put 20 different companies on the Dassault M&A radar. But I kept in touch with these guys. And when I left, with Patrick, who I mentioned before, we started a commercial project. We had acquired a piece of land, and we said, we're going to build an apartment building using these industrialized approaches and kind of eat our own dog food and show what can be done now, right? Because owners aren't really willing to do it. They're still stick building everything. And we started looking at all the different software startups that were out there. And so one of the teams we called was the Creo guys. And we said, we'd like to use your stuff on our project. And, got on a conference call with them, got a license to their basically they had taken it off the market, but they let us use it. And we applied it on a real world project in Worcester, Massachusetts that was everything you would find in a normal project. It had a sloping site. It was a weird shape. It was mixed use, right? And their software just couldn't do anything like that. And so after we were done with this, we ended up doing the initial design in Rhino, right? Like everybody does when they punt to what they know, because we had actually hired an architect out of Boston to help us with this. So we were doing it, the way that you would normally do it if you were an owner doing a mixed-use project in the States. And, we said, look, we contacted a number of these early design companies and said, look, your thing doesn't work the way we need it to. We ended up doing a Zoom call of how we did the preliminary design and the concept and the schematic. And so we said, look, we'll just send you the Zoom and you can watch it and see if you can learn anything. And the Creo guys got back to us because they had already started work on an urban master planning tool. And they hadn't shown it to anybody yet. But they basically looked at what we were trying to do on that site in Worcester. And a few weeks later said, look, we want to show you a demo of something that we've been working on. And so they showed us a very early version of Schema. It was, I think they had started on this thing because they saw that Spacemaker had been acquired by Autodesk. And so they decided, what can we do with the technology stack we have that's more like Spacemaker and less like what we've been trying to sell to a market that doesn't get it. And so when they showed us that, I realized, boy, these guys really have some good tech, but they just don't understand how to bring it to market. And so at that time, when I left Dassault, I started working for Charlie Cicchetti, who's the CEO of our company, in a different company. I said, Charlie, there's a really good team out here that could produce a very valuable piece of software, and we could help them take it to market. And so we just basically proposed a joint venture and signed a deal to acquire the software and the team, which is exactly what happened a year later. And that's how Schema got started. We started with a code base that already had 6 years of work into it, which is why we could come to market pretty fully formed. But as part of the deal, we basically ripped up their product roadmap for this new urban master planning tool and said, there is no urban master planning market. If you want to do this, you have to do something that architects can use on real projects. And we conceived this idea of the 3D puzzle pieces, which is now at the heart of Schema.ai.
Okay. Um, you have several videos on your website explaining what schema is, but maybe you can just shortly explain what are its functionalities. What is it used for?
Yeah, right now, it's squarely aimed at architects. Uh, we plan to have a second part of the go-to-market where we can use the data Schema generates to help organize the construction supply chain. That's a different set of actors, and the trick there is to do that without shifting risk to the architect. And we even conceive of a way of generating a revenue stream for the architect from this future use of some of the project data. But right now, we're squarely focused on architects and saving the architects 6 to 8 weeks of time, and I'll describe how we do that. So what Schema is it's web-based software, right? So there's nothing to install. It's a data-driven workflow. There are no files. We interact with systems that have files, but we do it with web services. We have integrations out of the box. We call this notion of having a data-driven workflow with all these integrations out of the box the Swiss Army knife. And I'll explain the Swiss Army knife a little bit more detailed. Our goal is to make this thing super easy to learn and use. In many cases, we're talking to principals at design firms and we're competing against trace paper. So we want this thing to be really easy to apply to a project. I think the other thing about what Schema is that it's our own software. As we said, we acquired the team that had written the code base that had 6 years of work into it. We've put another 2 years of work into it, so there's 8 years of work into it at this point. We don't have any technical dependencies on any of the major software vendors, so this is not built on Autodesk Platform Services or Forge or any other technology stack. It's our whole own technology stack. And what it allows us to do is ingest BIM projects to harvest knowledge from those previous projects and apply that knowledge to new projects. Not in a way that's like copying an AutoCAD block. It's something that allows us to extract the knowledge and create an assembly that's reusable and stretchable and what we call morphable, so that when an architect on a future project is trying to resolve the partie against the brief, they can use all these things they've previously built as stretchable 3D puzzle pieces that help them solve the problem much more. Well, first of all, it's faster, but the main thing is it cuts out the second step, which is typically them handing off some diagram to a team of people who then have to hand model that in Revit. And that's where the 6 to 8 weeks of savings come in.
Okay. Um, we are now on AI AEC show. What is AI doing on Schema?
So that's why, what AI enables it to do is ingest these BIM projects. So when you have a previous project, and so the examples of the kind of projects this workflow has been applied to. So Schema wants to be best in class in block and stack, and it needs some components, these puzzle pieces, to help you do the block and stack. We create those puzzle pieces from ingesting previous BIM projects. This is we've applied it to multifamily residential, hospitality, education, data centers, retail, healthcare. Healthcare is a great example. I was just talking to a senior healthcare designer at one of our customers about 2 weeks ago. And the way that they do a healthcare renovation is they will get an existing plan for whatever, because they're not doing new builds anymore. They're doing a lot of refits, right? So they get an existing plan. It already has columns. It already has all kinds of constraints. And they bring that as a PDF in the Bluebeam, and they're using it like Visio diagrams to literally lay things out. And then they print that out and hand it to a guy, and that person has a team that then hand models all that in Revit, and then they print that out and hand it back to the designer, and he redlines it. And that's not atypical. So, the goal of the design technology manager there is for this person, instead of using, Bluebeam like a Visio diagramming tool, is to use Schema to actually help lay out in 2D and stretch all the shapes. But because Schema is working with an entire MRI lab that's already been designed before, or a surgery room or whatever, as he stretches it, it knows where all the stuff should go because we've extracted that knowledge of how that thing is laid out from the previous examples. And so we're not training our software on the projects that we're getting. We're using computer vision techniques that were actually published a long time ago, 2019 at this point, to recognize the arrangements of things and say, oh, that's an MRI room. And so we can then label that as an MRI room, and we can look at the shapes of the equipment in there and label each one of those. And then that gives us, for instance, when the designer gets the model back and looks at it after we generate it, they have a checklist of what should be in the room, right? Because when they do it in Bluebeam, they don't. Um, so it's just things like that. What we're doing is, when we first came out with Schema, we had no AI in it, and we were very transparent. And in I think it was March of 23 I did the first interview with Martin Day about this, and I said, there's no AI because we're generating production data, and AI can be unpredictable, and we want to be very predictable. Since then, we've put AI into the catalog generation, and the reason is we had a very laborious process at the beginning where only our services team could build catalogs for people manually. And then the number one request was, give us a tool so that we can do it ourselves, because the designers want to control all the inputs to their project, which is natural. So we did that. We shipped that tool about a year ago, but it still involves a lot of manual adjustment, because what we find is that data in previous architectural projects has all sorts of issues, wall joints, mislabeled spaces and stuff. And that's really what we're using AI to fix. So the latest version of this is what we call the one-click catalog builder, where you just point at the project, it recognizes all of the spaces that you want to reuse, it recognizes the stuff in them, it fixes any wall joins, it labels the stuff properly. And so AI is allowing us to ingest this data, learn from the knowledge, and prevent the garbage in, garbage out problem, because we clean the data up as we ingest it into our catalog for use on our future projects. And that's very valuable. It saves a lot of time in doing the pre-work so that you can use Schema on a new project.
Okay, yeah, now I see. I understand what you're doing with AI. Yeah, very good. What is the output of Schema? What do you get once you've done this modeling?
Yeah, so as I said, we've applied this in multifamily, hospitality, education, data centers, all sorts of different projects. The output is native Revit data. So we have 4 people who were on the original Revit startup team in our company, and we understand a lot of sort of what Revit does under the covers as far as its data generation. And the rule in Schema is, no matter what you do in Schema, it has to be able to produce a high quality Revit model. And we produce that data natively. So we're not producing an IFC model and then translating it or running it through platform services. We've actually implemented multiple different pipelines to generate the Revit data, basically to see which one is the most high performance, and we're using the one that's most high performance. But we produce the native data in Revit using a Revit plugin. So you literally load up the plugin, point it at your Schema account, and say, take this option from this project in my Schema account and pull the Revit data at LOD 350 into this empty project. And that's how you get the project now. What we've done is, over the last 6 months, we've made Schema embeddable in other systems, because we're a web app. So typically, this is the classic example was running a SketchUp extension. There are web extensions to SketchUp, like the way you do geolocation in SketchUp is a web extension. And so we've made a web extension, which is Schema as a web extension to SketchUp, that can synchronize data back and forth. Right now, our Revit plugin is something that just synchronizes data up and down, but it's not a live sync. Whenever you do the transaction, you get the data in Schema, and whenever you do the transaction the other way, you get the data in Revit. We're now re-architecting that so that it follows this, embedding extension mechanism that we wrote when we did the work with Trimble, so that Revit becomes essentially the catalog manager for updating catalogs in Schema. so that what we're trying to do is make it so that everybody who's learned whatever native apps they use today, whether it's SketchUp, Rhino, Revit, those are still full-fledged citizens in the workflow Schema uses. And so we've stitched them together in this concept called the tool chain, which we borrowed from the movie and gaming industries, where you can take different tools and put them together into a workflow. But in that industry, you don't have to wrangle files, right? Because it's not file-based, it's a data-driven workflow. So that's what we're trying to build by using this block and stack capability in the center to mediate between the early tools like SketchUp and Rhino and the later tools like Revit and ArchiCAD and things like that.
Okay.
But our default is we generate native Revit data.
Mm.
And then we also generate IFC data, but that's something where we have way fewer customers that are doing that. Most of them are just generating native Revit data.
Okay. So your tool is at the moment it's used by architects basically. So if we think about AI and architecture and creative work in general, uh, what is the role of AI in the future? How do you see it? Is it going to be an assistant or maybe replace some processes? Maybe those processes that are not really fun. But
Yeah.
how do you see it?
Well, I won't claim to know that I know how it's gonna unfold. I think we have a duty to shape how it unfolds. I agree with you that human in the loop is a far better application of AI as an assistant as opposed to a replacement. I don't think AI is going to replace architects and produce good results. I mean, it might replace architects and produce some really bad results, and those results might get better over time. But one of the things that we see is that we've talked about how in these project types, a firm might use an asset that they have, but they haven't been able to use, like all these projects, to ease their future work and get rid of some of the redundant tasks, right? That's 6 to 8 weeks of manual entry that happens after the senior designer gets done with their initial diagram. Um, that catalog that we build from the previous projects is an asset of the firm that the firm is gonna find valuable because it allows them to create proposals for that type of project much more easily. We also have, investors who are owners. So we have retail owners that are investors in the company. We have data center owners that have been very interested in applying these workflows. And we've had situations, for instance, where we have a design firm in Southern California that recruits out of a technical high school. And they've said, can you share our catalog with this technical high school so that when we hire them as interns, they already know how to use the layouts of the
Mm,
catalog, right? And so we actually see this idea of having an asset of reusable pieces that represent the chunks of buildings that a design team might use as something very valuable in and of itself. So, for instance, a data center owner might say, here are the layouts for the racks in our data in our server halls. Here's the layout for how we like to do electrical yards. So, that is something that an owner could curate and the design team could help them curate it by providing the labor to keep it up to date as its own separate sort of product database of the way that the design gets executed for that owner. I mean, this is not unusual for design firms to do. When I was working as an architect, we had templates for Kaiser Permanente for each different medical owner because they all had the way they liked to do it. And this is how schema catalogs are intended to be applied. I might have a schema catalog for Kaiser hospitals or a schema catalog for this type of hospital system. And we see that, in the case of retail, that retail chain might have their own catalog of these chunks that they hand to an architect that they want to work with in a different part of the country and say, use these to resolve this brief in schema, and then you can do the site adapt of the project as it gets built and be the architect of record. So we see what we're bringing to the table as something that might enable the supply chain to work better together. We don't consider ourselves a collaboration platform. Like I said, we consider
mm,
ourselves a fast forward button. And we're intended to work with whatever collaboration platform the team is currently using. So if you're using ACC, you keep using ACC, right? Autodesk Construction Cloud or Autodesk Docs. But if in the future you're going to use Motif, fine. If you're going to use some other web-based thing, that's great. We're intending to be a data-driven system that is a good citizen of whatever tool chain you put it in. And so that way we're trying to take a different approach than, saying we're a platform and everybody has to play by our rules. That is kind of a 15-year-old idea that everybody recognizes the downsides to that. And instead we want to be, we use this term co-opetition for our thesis on this. So, but that's the whole point, is to create this ecosystem of tools that can work together.
Well, do you see a possibility for a marketplace for libraries? Somebody,
Oh, yeah, certainly there could be. We, I, you know, I, yes. Have I thought about it much? Not really.
yeah, I just, well, came to my mind that maybe somebody who's really good at something, doing certain types of buildings, they might be interested to build those libraries and maybe
Yeah, and this
sell them.
sort of mirrors what is happening in the field as it is, where if you're looking at this is happening a lot in hotel projects where they're not designing bathrooms anymore. They're buying a bathroom pod, which is why DPR bought a bathroom pod manufacturing company a few years ago.
Mhm.
Because they're not building that with wet trades on site any longer. They're just buying a pod. It has standardized interfaces. They pick it with a crane and they drop it on the floor and wheel it into place, and the bathroom's done, finishes and everything. And so, there's a company that builds that as a product, right? And the virtual version of that just represents the physical product that somebody could buy. And this type of approach is something that, I was advocating working at Dassault for 10 years. Schema is a different way of delivering something similar. But yeah, to the extent, for instance, we've been working with Shop Architects. They have a manufacturing sister company called Assembly OSM, and same thing, productized buildings that you can configure in something like Schema, but then they can actually deliver the building as a productized output. So, marketplace, yes, I see absolute lots of opportunities for it. How? That's really, the sky's the limit on what people are willing to offer as productized approaches, whether that's panelized or volumetric, or I think it's going to be a whole lot of different approaches.
Yeah. But now we're talking about architectural design. How about MEP, for example?
Yeah, we did an example last summer at Next Build where we generated a school in Schema, and then we showed this tool chain, and we handed the Revit output from that to another company, Augmenta, that does MEP generation. And we also, as part of the example, did our own structural LOD 400 generation. So the idea being that um, you design the structure and architecture in context of one another so that you eliminate clash, right? The structure doesn't clash with the architecture
Mm.
because it's been generated together from these puzzle pieces, these 3D puzzle pieces. And then once you have that, you identify the equipment locations for the MEP and all the terminal points, which were part of the puzzle pieces you used when you laid out the building. And then something like an Augmenta can route those so that they avoid all the architecture and all the structure. So the theory behind this is you get an LOD 400 model for the MEP that is pre-clashed. It doesn't have clashes. So you can use clash detection to verify there are no clashes, but it's a pre-coordinated building that you could pre-manufacture. And that's our approach to it. So we currently don't have MEP functionality in the product. However, we have like 3 big MEP firms as investors in the company. We do have on the roadmap how we handle MEP systems that are part of Revit designs that we're ingesting, which is a little more complicated because MEP components in Revit have connectors themselves that make the component recognize that it's part of a connected system. So when you divorce those from the system they're in and then have to reconstitute it later, there are some interesting cases that you have to handle. So those are on our roadmap. They're not currently in the product, but that's part of the problem set that we're working on.
Okay. So, if any one of our listeners is now really interested in trying out Schema, where should they start?
Yeah, I would go to the website Schema.ai, and you can find information on how to get a trial there. You can also join our email list, and we will share the latest and greatest with you. Um, if you want to learn more about sort of our philosophy behind the product and all of these topics we've been discussing, we have a blog on the website that has some of these things written out in.
Yeah, it's very good, by the way.
Oh, good. Very thank you for thanks for that. So yeah, I would go to the website, sign up for the newsletter, and you can even request a demo, and we'll be happy to talk to you.
Marty, I would love to talk much longer, but maybe at this point, I have to say thank you very much for your insights, and I'm looking forward to your next innovations around Schema.
Well, Arnie, thank you for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed it. I hope it was useful for all your listeners.